Thank you, Morgan. This is the 5th subcommittee that was formed for the task force. There are others focused on equity, data and health disparities, best practices for community engagement, and the definition of disproportionately impacted communities. This 5th subcommittee was formed to specifically focus on Indigenous community engagement and think about how and when and if appropriate, this task force would engage with any sort of tribal government officials and kind of share some of the work that we are doing with them. Before we dive into the agenda, I do want to provide a brief land acknowledgement. So as we do welcome everyone into today's meeting space, let's pause and acknowledge that what is now Colorado includes the land of the Ute, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Dene, Lakota, Apache, and Puebloan nations, and many tribes, and that the sovereign tribal governments of the Ute, Mountain Ute, and Southern Ute Indian tribes still reside in this state. These tribes are the original stewards of these natural areas, and we want to take a moment to honor and respect these original stewards of the environment and their relationship with the land. So with that, I do want to just briefly highlight what was discussed at the last meeting. As many folks remember, so this is our 3rd meeting with the Indigenous Community Engagement Subcommittee. And at the last meeting, we did have a really great guest speaker come, Gussie Lord, who is the managing attorney of tribal partnerships at Earth Justice. And she provided a presentation on historical information about federal Indian law and federal Indian law policies. And I think that provided a lot of really great background for our task force members and the folks that were in attendance. At the last meeting, we started to kind of do a deep dive into talking a bit more about the objectives that we've outlined, and I'll drop the agenda in this chat. And so folks can click on that and have access to the agenda, which is on our public drive. And folks can access all the meeting recordings, notes, everything there. But for the purposes of today's agenda, I did want to highlight the objectives. So the 3 major objectives that we've talked about are creating a relationship and open communication between sovereign tribal governments and this task force, identifying recommendations, whether that be recommendations about financing grants, structural changes to state agency practice, including staffing and hiring, housing resources, and best practices for outreach and engagement. All these recommendations that provide long-term support for our Indigenous communities. And then lastly, determining whether the definition of disproportionately impacted community should include Indigenous communities, and if so, how it should do so. What are the parameters around that? Again, we have 3 task force members that are with us here today, and I just want to be clear that the recommendations that are being formed are coming from the task force members, including Jamie, Ilda, and Ian, who are here. The recommendations are not reflective of CDPHE staff. These are thoughts and ideas that are coming from task force members as well as members of the public. We are soliciting public comment. Velma, for example, here, we've seen you come to many of these meetings, provide verbal public comment. We've received your written public comment, which will be incorporated into the next draft of the recommendations. So just want to make sure that folks know that this is a very collective effort. I want to just shed some light on the kind of 3 questions that have been guiding some of our work. So this is kind of the 415 section of the agenda if people are following along and writing. And so there are kind of 3 major questions that have been popping up and that we want to talk about maybe in a little bit more detail to get more refined in our recommendations. And if folks are curious about what recommendations that have come out of this subcommittee in particular, they're kind of small and somewhat short. In the 520 section of the agenda, you can see the few recommendations that this subcommittee has produced. We haven't met a whole lot, and there's a lot of room to expand and elaborate on these recommendations and to write more. But these 3 questions in the 415 section may help us get there. And so this first question, how can we ensure that tribal governments have an opportunity to provide input on the recommendations of the task force in a manner that works for them and respects their sovereignty? I think that is a really big question that this subcommittee has repeatedly asked. And one of the major reasons that we've invited Ernest House Jr. here today to come speak with us and provide some insight and engage in a dialogue with our task force members. And then a couple of other questions. How can we best engage Indigenous people living in urban areas as part of our broader work on community engagement? And then should areas under tribal jurisdiction be classified as disproportionately impacted communities? And if so, under what prongs of the definition? That's just kind of a broad overview. So objectives and then kind of 3 major guiding questions. Before I turn it over to Ernest House Jr. To kind of shed some light on any perspectives he can provide. And thank you, Ian. Ian was one of the people that suggested that we bring you into this space, Ernest. And so I'm glad that we were able to set this up and make this happen. But before we turn it over, I do want to just give Rachel O'Brien-Acker, who is the CDPHE tribal liaison, an opportunity to kind of just share any updates or insights that she has on kind of what you know on these objectives and questions thus far, and kind of get us a little further grounded before we deep dive. I see, Ian, you have your hand up, so go ahead, and then I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Oh, I really appreciate that. Hello to the audience and welcome to our guests. I'm Ian Thomas Tafoya. I co-chair the entire Environmental Justice Action Task Force, and I was one of the people who drove to create this because we had so many questions that existed. I also just wanted to give people an update about the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs, and that both Jaime and I were able to attend the last quarterly meeting. Jaime, I don't think actually ended up testifying. I think I was the only one who spoke because he said I covered it pretty well. We were kind of prepared in case it took more time. But we did express our desire to continually offer the space to tribal governments, to let them know what is happening, ask for their input where they want to give it, and really coming to them in a place of, as citizens of this state, and in a position to actually drive changes that may ultimately impact them, we want to be good partners. And so we laid that out. Unfortunately, I haven't heard any follow-up or met any or had any contact post that, but I did want to share that we did go on behalf of the task force and present that information to the tribal governments in good faith. And that's where we stand.
Thanks for sharing that update, Ian. And yeah, an important detail to definitely include after our second meeting. Well, during our second meeting, we did have Catherine Redhorse and Jennifer Lewis from CCIA attending and kind of guiding us in what the appropriate process would be to participate in that meeting. And so as Ian just mentioned, him and Jamie were able to participate in the public comment session. And I think maybe Ernest and Rachel, with your guidance, which we have some kind of time to talk about next steps towards the end of the meeting, but obviously any sort of guidance can be woven in throughout the meeting on, maybe next steps of how to further engage. As Ian mentioned, it sounds like, we want to continue rolling the ball. And so if that, going beyond public comment, maybe having some time on the agenda for the task force to share the progress of the recommendations and do a bit more of a deep dive and meet folks where they're at would be super helpful. So
thank you for that. And I just want to say one other thing, and that is to welcome to Chase. We really appreciated your comments at the last main meeting where we all met in person for the first time, and it makes my day to see you here in this space, because this space is intentionally for people like us. And I just really appreciate your follow through and being present after we invited you and told you about it.
Wopila, thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it.
And just briefly on that note, I also wanted to point out that while there isn't a dedicated public comment period, you'll see that little note or caveat at the very end of the agenda. Because we are a small group and because we want this to be just an open, safe space, public members of the public are just welcome to participate throughout the meeting, ask questions, drop comments in the chat. It's much more of an informal space than our much larger meetings. So, all right. So, Rachel, any thoughts or insights that you might be able to provide at this time would be great.
Yeah, actually, transitioned beautifully, the series of comments here. They were a great lead up. So just a quick introduction for folks I might not have met before. My name is Rachel Bryan-Ocker. I'm a citizen of the Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska, and I am the tribal liaison for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. I've been absent the past few months. I just had a baby. She's 4 months old and loves to scream from the background. So if that's what you hear, that's her. Making her needs known. So I'm really happy to be here and just sort of re-engage with you all now that I'm back on the job. A couple of updates that I think are relevant. I did talk to Catherine Redhorse earlier this week, and we've been talking a lot about this subcommittee and the work of the task force lately. And so she thinks that CCIA can make some time on the September CCIA quarterly meeting available to this subcommittee or to the larger task force, whatever seems most appropriate, to present and have some actual agenda time. And just so you all know that agenda time is at a premium. Those meetings are very, very full these days. So I want to offer that up as an opportunity. If this group would like to put together a presentation to present at that quarterly meeting, you do have some agenda time. Another recommendation that I and Catherine might make is that now that there are some draft recommendations that could actually be reviewed, it might be a good time to put together a formal letter, ideally from the task force, but Catherine and I would be happy to work with you around sort of making the letter more formal and identifying the appropriate folks to send it to, but putting together a letter to each tribal government, sort of inviting them to engage with the draft recommendations. They may or may not have the time or be able to prioritize doing that, but I think some formality and some just making sure that this is on their radar, and if they want to take the opportunity, it's been sort of highlighted for them, would be good. And ideally, I think that would happen before the September CCIA quarterly meeting, so that there's some opportunity to engage with that. Those quarterly meetings are a really great opportunity for folks to come together, but also there's often a lot of stuff discussed from sort of across many, many areas of work and interest. I know our commissioners get like just packets and packets of information ahead of the meetings. So it might be valuable to send that letter and the draft recommendations sort of well ahead of that September meeting, so that it kind of stands out a little bit from the many, many documents that commissioners are likely to be reviewing. So those are some opportunities we highlighted in terms of engagement with the two tribes. Also, I know that another sort of scope of interest for this subcommittee is reaching out to Native communities and Native organizations sort of at large throughout the state. And I think there's a large variety of ways that those are going to happen. And I think there are folks on this subcommittee who really know how to get out into community. But there is a CCIA sponsored opportunity. They are putting together a policy group that's going to really focus on bringing Native community organizations and Native voice into policy discussions. And they have an upcoming meeting August 16th. And if this subcommittee or task force were interested in presenting on this work to that policy group, you could also get some agenda time for that meeting. So just some upcoming opportunities. And in general, this is my soapbox that I'm always on, but I want to make sure that when we're outreaching to tribal governments, we're kind of doing the balance of giving them as much opportunity information as possible, but also really respecting their time, their investment, their interest or disinterest, whatever it turns out to be. We want to make sure that we're operating in a way that really is sovereignty affirming and consistent with the government to government relationship that we have as state of Colorado government with the Ute Mountain Ute tribe and the Southern Ute Indian tribe. So that'll always be my sort of little echo of reminder for folks. Just keep that in the back of your mind as you're engaging in communication, that we are engaging with sovereigns on a government to government basis. And if you ever have questions about what that means or how to embody that in a specific situation, reach out to me and we can sort of think through and work that out together. I'm happy to make myself available to you. Oh, one more thing before I move on. I don't want to miss it. I know that some area of discussion in the priorities and objectives that your group have outlined are around whether tribal jurisdiction should be classified as disproportionately impacted communities. And I do just want to offer a reminder for folks that Southern Ute has indicated to us that they do not want to be labeled with that particular language. They have expressed interest in having access to funding streams that might be associated with that label, but they're uncomfortable with that terminology. So I just want to highlight that for folks as your conversation evolves. I do think it's important to respect the interests of Southern Ute tribe in particular. And also simultaneously, I want to identify that that's not necessarily the opinion of both tribes or of all Indigenous people, that there's a lot of particular communities, who might not have that discomfort, but just offering that reminder.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. I really appreciate it. And congratulations. It's so exciting. We got a chance to meet each other right before you left. So I'm so happy for your blessing that's come to you and your family. My gut feeling is, yes, we take every opportunity to keep this conversation and this work moving. I'm very grateful that they are willing to give us some time, because I sat through that whole meeting and you're right, it's a lot and I learned a lot. And of all the different sources of funding and the internet and all, there were just so many things that were talked about, and so many agencies that have to come forward and speak out in the impact. So, I think that I really enjoyed it. I want to encourage anybody who's watching this, to take the time to attend one of these. I think it was something I'm going to try to put on my schedule more to understand that. And I can't speak for everyone and the votes, but I certainly would like to take steps forward to present to both of those groups like you were talking about. And I think the concerns around the word DIC are fine. I honestly, perhaps there's a better word that we could be using all the way around that is more meaningful about the future we want to have than what's happened in the past. But
Thank you, Ian. I appreciate those blessings. And I would be remiss if I didn't call out that we have Ernest House Jr. on this call, and he has been so influential in developing that relationship that we now are bearing, that's now bearing fruit in the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs. So I just want to call out that acknowledgement quickly.
yes, and we couldn't be more blessed to also have you here, Ernest. We had a chance to talk about this in the mountains, and I know you put a lot of work into this, and there must, in my perspective, you always wish there was more you could do than you could get done in the time you were in a certain role or doing certain things. So I'm all ears to what could be improved and what we can advocate for.
Absolutely. I didn't know if this is the time I should launch in.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, the one thing I just wanted to emphasize, Rachel, or lift up was the opportunity for task force members here to participate in the September CCIE meeting. Could you remind folks of the date, if you know it off the top of your head?
When I talked to Catherine earlier this week, they're still finalizing it with tribal leadership. So when I know the date, I will share it with you. Okay,
great. So just something to have on your radar, Ilda, Jamie, and Ian, for participation and kind of thinking now about how we might want to kind of put our heads together and present at that meeting and exactly what that would look like. So great. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. I hope you can stick around for as long as you can. I know that you have to drop a little bit early and not be able to stay for the entirety of this meeting, but looks like we are right on time. And so I would love to turn it over to our guest speaker, Ernest House Jr. Ernest is the Senior Policy Director of Keystone Policy Center and is the former Executive Director for the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs. So Ernest, I don't think I need to say anymore. I would love for you to kind of share a bit about yourself and your background and provide any insights that you have regarding the questions and objectives that this task force and subcommittee have outlined thus far. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, Mike the Guban the Hoyak, which means hello and thank you, my friends, for the opportunity to be with you. And thank you. It's great to see Rachel, and it's so great to hear about your addition to your family, Rachel. And thanks again, Ian, for the invitation, and Lubna for our conversation in preparation for this meeting. I'm really excited to see this effort. As someone who's worked within state government, as Lubna mentioned, I was the former executive director for the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs from 2005 to 2018. And that was under 3 governors and 4 lieutenant governors, but who's counting? And I think that part of that process is that the different ebbs and flows from both political parties to conversations to awareness. And a lot of people do not know that the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs is the only agency that focuses on strengthening that government to government relationship. In fact, Colorado is the only state where our lieutenant governor has a statutory responsibility to chair the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs and to ensure that a government to government relationship is conducted. No other state has their lieutenant governor with that role. And I think a lot of times when you look at state government, a lot of people, even I feel like sometimes lieutenant governors running for the role don't know what a lieutenant governor does or whether it's lieutenant governor's office does. And so it's adapted and it's changed over the years. But since 1976, the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs was in statute housed in the lieutenant governor's office to do such a thing. I'm a member of the Ute Mountain Ute tribe from southwestern Colorado. I live in Denver, but I also live in southwestern Colorado. Still have a home on the reservation, back on the Ute Mountain Reservation, and I split my time. I just got back last week from about a month and a half down there, which was great. And what I do now is really utilizing and bringing the conversations that we have in Colorado, or we have had over 12 years, and even still going on now, to tribal communities across the country and even internationally. Around repatriation efforts, the importance of things like updating antiquated federal policies and state policies, like Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act conversations. You know, there's just a lot that's going on. Colorado has a lot to be proud of, and I would, even though there's 2 federally recognized tribes within the state lines that we call Colorado, I'd put the state tribal relationship up against any other state in the country. And I know I'm a little biased in saying that, but I say that because of so many different things. And I actually just want to share, I don't know if I can share my screen with you. I think I can here. I want to just share a couple slides with you, because the information, I think, when we talk about engagement with tribes, is we often don't realize our own state tribal history. And it's so important to realize how we got to this place. And so part of that is really, if you are Indigenous and if you come from Indigenous communities, you know your own story about land loss and displacement. But I feel a lot of times that is often not utilized, and I can send those slides. I don't think I can share it with you. I guess it's disabled on my end, but I can share that information with you. But just because we have the two, well, the Utes as we.
Hey, Ernest, I think we can make sure that you get the ability to do that if we give them a second to approve that. I think
Okay. Yeah, I'll keep trying there, and Lubna, you let me know if that's something, then I can send it. I can even show it at the end. But even though we have 2 federally recognized tribes, we have 46 other tribes that have always and will continue to call Colorado home. Thank you. I'm actually going to be seeing if you can see this right now. And oftentimes people ask, who are the Utes? Where are the Utes? And I'm just talking about the oldest continuous residents of what we call the state of Colorado right now. And historically, we're actually several bands, very similar to many other tribal nation histories as well. But these 7 bands are listed right here, and probably more familiar to people who have went out in the Weminuche Wilderness, the Grand River. These are national forests, there's rivers, they're historic landmarks, they're names that were taken by the Utes and used in these other avenues, right? But to us as Utes, I mean, if you were to ask my own tribal community who we are, how we refer to ourselves, we would say that we're Nuchu, N-U-C-H-U. That means the people in our language. And obviously there's 574 federally recognized tribes throughout the United States, including Alaska. And for those that still speak our indigenous languages, we always have a word for us, right? The Utes was a Spanish term. It was actually a Dominguez Escalante expedition that came through what is now the western slope of Colorado, that was the first to identify or list what we call, well, what they referred to when they saw us was Utes. They call us Utahs. And then Utahs transitioned into Utes. We had our first treaty with the Spanish, and numerous treaties after that with the Spanish. We were one of the first tribes to access the horse from the Spanish and to trade with the Spanish. So there's a lot of interaction in what is now southern Colorado, which would have then been northern Mexico, and going into Santa Fe. Outside of all that, though, our Ute bands, the several that I've listed here, consolidated to make up 3 tribes today. Mine is the largest band out of all those. We're the Weminuche band. We're in Toyoak, Colorado. The southern Ute is the Mwacha, the Capote band in Ignacio. And then our sister tribe, the Northern Utes in Fort Duchesne, Utah, make up the other 4. But I wanted to show you, actually, I'm going to skip over a couple of these ones. Here is a slide that I usually show of the state that all of us recognize. The green dots are really just the cities and towns to give you an idea of location. Prior to statehood, I would have said that Utes in particular, that the whole state, the whole region was traditional Ute territory. We still have hunting blinds still standing in Rocky Mountain National Park, up in Estes Park. Our last bear dance was, historically listed in 1908 in Garden of the Gods, right out of Colorado Springs. And of course, numerous trail systems, now highways, 285, the Colorado Trail, things that we like to get out and experience. They're all originated as Ute passageways and Ute trail systems. But our Ute history is really first started with this first Ute reservation established in 1868. This was run by Nathan Meeker, the first Indian agent for then the state of Colorado. And the headquarters was located near what is now Meeker, Colorado, named after Nathan Meeker. But the interesting thing here is that, the blue line, and for this first treaty between the federal government, the state, and the Utes, was that Utes were not allowed to leave the blue line. If we wanted to leave the blue line, we had to get permission. For those that know this history, this is also the time frame for us around rations, bringing food and things to a headquarters and then divvied out to the tribe. But because our bands we're nomadic people, we do not have a migration history. We believe we were born from these mountains. And so the dependence on fish, on elk, on deer, on ungulates was what sustained us. I mean, archaeologists will tell you at History Colorado that they believe that, based on their research, that Utes have been in what we call Colorado for the last 10 to 12,000 years. But of course, if you ask us as Indigenous people, we'll say we've been here since time immemorial, right? That we were born from here. But the reason why this is so interesting is that this was a huge turning point. From the first point in the 1800s, around the 1820s and 30s, seeing westward expansion, seeing manifest destinies, federal policies, and then gearing up to have Colorado potentially enter into the Union. This was the emphasis that, you know, you have numerous tribes on the Eastern Plains, you have a handful of tribes up in the mountains, but Colorado had an Indian problem. That was the quote by then Territorial Governor John Evans, and that Colorado needed to remove them. So this was Colorado, this was the state's first process around, and the federal government process around our first treaty, establishing and trying to just put us on that area within that blue line. The point after that was then we start to see the carvings out, you know, the southwestern portion there. If you've ever been to the southwestern part of the state, it's the most beautiful part of the state. Of course, I'm a bit biased, but especially that general area is the San Juans, the La Platas. That's where Silverton, Ouray, Telluride, over 400 miles of tunnels due to mining is there. So the other thing on the federal side, the agreement was, okay, Utes can't leave the blue line, but settlers were not allowed to go into the blue line. Well, there's no way that they could have anticipated the amount of westward expansion by settlers moving into that blue line. So this is where we start to see the not only traffic, but really illegal trespassing of mining in the San Juans prior to the treaty being redeveloped. So this is the Bruno session, and it was named after Felix Bruno. Felix Bruno was the United States superintendent of Indian Affairs at the time. And they carved this area out, but they gave the Utes the opportunity and said, if you agree to the treaty, we'll still allow you to hunt and fish in this approximately 4 million acres of area, so long as the grass grows and the Indians are at peace with the white men. That's how the treaty ended. That was the last sentence, right? This was during that time frame. And I bring this up because this is the only continuous example of, throughout the United States, which I haven't been aware of any other ones, around a successful off-reservation fishing and hunting right that's still being utilized today. I think a lot of people look at Martinez v. Wyoming as one that was challenged and all the way up to the Supreme Court around off-reservation fishing and hunting rights. We actually, in Colorado at the time, we were proposing this as an example to the U.S. Supreme Court as a workable solution for not only allowing Indigenous communities to continue to exercise their fishing and hunting right that was identified prior to Colorado statehood. This was signed in 1874. Believe it or not, I mean, there has been attempts, surprise, surprise, over the years to change this or get rid of this agreement. But fortunately, and the tribes have been able to hold on to that. So when I go back and say that Colorado has one of the best working relationships between tribes and the state, I look at this example of off-reservation hunting. And if you follow the Supreme Court, I'm not an attorney, but if you follow the Supreme Court and its recent decisions around tribal jurisdiction and sovereignty, and those of us that are really worried and scared to see how that conversation is going, we don't need to look very far other than states' relationships with tribes. If it's voter access, if it's tribal jurisdiction, if it's Indian Child Welfare Act, it doesn't matter what it is. They all start at a local level. So that's why it's so important that I think that task force like yours and what you're doing gives voice to the importance and the awareness at a local level, because that's where these issues start. After it's called the Meeker Massacre. Historically, we call it the Meeker Incident with the tribes, because when I think of a massacre, I think of like the Sand Creek Massacre and that awareness around there. That was not what happened at the Meeker Massacre, but you should check it out if you have not. And then now we have what you see here today. The blue line is my tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation. We're in 3 states, 600,000 acres. We're a communal land-owned reservation, 7-member governing council, little over 2,000 members, and our blood quantum is half blood to full blood requirement for enrollment with our tribe. The Southern Indian tribe is in the red. They're a checkerboard reservation. They're 7-member governing council. They have about 1,400 members, and their total tribal lands is about 300,000, mostly within the state of Colorado, or all within the state of Colorado. And their blood quantum enrollment requirement is 1/4 to full blood. Now, I share all that stuff, and we get into the details of all that, but I start with the Utes, and then I transition to what the tribes you see here. These are the 48 historic tribes of Colorado. So it's great to see that if there's state legislation that's drafted today, this last 2 years, next year, that there'll be information that these tribes will be listed as historic tribes of Colorado. This list was created in 2007, and Colorado at the time was the first state in the country to create a protocol to address a loophole within the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. That loophole required that you could not return Native American human remains or associated funerary objects to tribes unless they were identified or a tribe came forward to make a claim. And Colorado at the time, I mean, this was early 2000s, and by 2007, we had over 400 Native American human remains and or associated funerary objects in our state possession at the time, with no avenue of returning it. The reason why is because they're identified as culturally unidentifiable. So there was nothing with them to associate a connection with the tribe or a tribe to make a claim. So what the state did is tried to pull together, the first time ever, on the tribes with legacy of occupation in what we call Colorado. So reaching out took 3 years to meet with all these tribes to come forward to actually pull an agreement together that would return and reinter Native American, culturally unidentifiable Native American human remains. Now states have done that and above the letter of the law, which is great to see. But anymore, I think that not only do we have the relationship with our Ute tribes today and the Ute Mountain Ute, Southern Ute, and even Northern Ute, but then there's been active engagement with these tribes that you see on this list. These tribes have provided a preponderance of evidence, which would be a legacy of occupation in what we call the state of Colorado. It's not like, somebody just says, hey, I think I heard a story my great grandfather used to tell me about, the area of Fort Collins or the Roaring Fork Valley. There has to be a preponderance of evidence there. And History Colorado maintains this relationship. It's important for a couple reasons. One, we have ongoing tribal consultations and tribal outreach that we need to ensure that there's updated who the current tribal leadership is, how to reach out to those folks. But it also, from a historic standpoint, from a NAGPR standpoint, after we passed this agreement in 2007 with these tribes, now there is no reason the state of Colorado should ever have any Native American human remain in the state's possession and not returned to a tribe or reburied in the ground. So because of that protocol, that they maintain this relationship with these tribes. I think a lot of times people just look at tribes and states, and they just look at the tribes within the state and they go, okay, those are the tribes. This actually blows everything out of the water. This is actually actively creating engagement with tribes that were forcibly removed over the last 170 years since Colorado statehood. You know, this is the future of the conversation that we should be having around relationship building. If we remove political boundaries, state boundaries, jurisdictions, we're going to see more collaboration of this type, because these folks always, I mean, you can't, there's no way. I mean, I'd be shocked if anybody would ever tell the Northern Cheyenne, Northern Arapaho, or Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho that Colorado is not their home. Clearly, you know, Sand Creek Massacre out at Eads, if you've not been there, go check it out. That is a part of our history. That is Colorado history. That is US history. And so we need to be a part of that. So I say all this and I bring all this information to you because I think it feeds into what I was reading as the objectives of the task force. And I think it also plays into being very important around what you just saw, what I just shared with you. Unless you went to History Colorado and you saw that exhibit, unless you went to some speech or presentation by a tribal member, unless you took that elective in your college, you know, course, which a lot of people didn't, probably would never even see that information. And that's just the Ute information. That's not the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Comanche, the Sioux. I mean, we could go on and on, but I usually like to stop to begin there, because it's an important part of how we have this conversation and addressing your questions, which I will turn to in a minute, but I see Ian's hand.
Yeah, Ernest, I mean, I really appreciate it. I got a Native American Studies degree and I still didn't learn everything that you taught me. It took me years of putting books together. I'm wondering, and this is just my own personal nerd inside of me, but could you go back to the slide with the bands, and can you say the bands for us? Because I always feel like, you know, you make your best guess at pronunciation unless you find a speaker of a language. And I really appreciate this, the tribal nations. I have yet to actually see that list presented when any of the state makes presentations, but yeah, I would just really love to hear them.
Well, the Mawach and the Capote band, that, I mean, the Southern Utes will also have a different dialect. So yeah. Ute Mountain will have a different dialect, Southern Utes, and then Northern Utes as well. But the Weemanooch and Tabaguach, the Yampikras, I mean, a lot of this is, you can see and especially the Uinta Basin, these are all, there's the example of Utes we speak a Uto-Aztecan language, and which is also an Athabascan language connected to like Shoshonean language, Paiutes. And so we share a lot of similarities within our language system, but our tribe just came out with our first, believe it or not, our first tribal dictionary app like 2 months ago. And I'd be happy to share it with this group, because it's the first time we're actually putting elders saying these phrases and terms, and we're all agreeing on that. I mean, even with the state of Colorado, we didn't have our first Ute history curriculum for fourth graders until 2018. And it took us 3 years just to get our tribal elders to agree on the terminology of, you know, a word, a phrase, a creation story, you know, so it goes back and forth amongst us all. But, you know, the Mawach, the Capote band, Weemanooch, Tabaguach, Yampikras, Uinta Basin, Uinta bands, that all these bands are so important. And I'm seeing, at least in my work, I'm seeing a resurgence, an awareness of these bands going back to identifying us as Weemanooch band, or me as Weemanooch band, or so-and-so from the Mawach Capote band.
Thanks, Ernest. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Before I move on to any questions, the initial questions, I didn't know if anybody else had any other questions. So I wanted to transition to your question, Lubna, which was how can we ensure that tribal governments have an opportunity to provide input on the recommendations of the task force in a manner that works for them and respects their sovereignty. You know, it's great to hear that you're already reaching out to CCI. I know Catherine's been able to join us, and also the conversations with Rachel and engagement. That is a huge component. Utilizing CCIA, that's why it's there. That is why the CCIA has that statutory responsibility. But I think the other way that, and it's hard. I mean, out of all the boards and commissions at the state, which you should check out if you haven't already, and actively try to get on these boards and commissions, just like this task force, because it's that outreach, it's that potential. A lot of people in Southwestern Colorado and tribal communities for the longest time told me, well, we didn't know we could engage or we should engage with that agency because we're our own sovereign nation. We're our tribe. Our tribal leadership takes care of us. But there shares that dual citizenship, right? That active engagement of being a Colorado resident and also being a member of a tribal nation. So it doesn't matter, at least in my opinion, and that's active agreements already in place trying to increase voter turnout in both Ute Mountain and Southern Ute, which, by the way, if you haven't checked that out, the outreach doubled in the last election based on just the tribal outreach. So when people tell me that tribal outreach doesn't work, I look at that example just as #1 example of voter participation, of getting through the roof, of putting more ballot boxes in communities and driving that awareness and getting people more engaged. So I would not only, I'm glad that CCI was because that's a great place to start. I'd also follow up with tribal leadership. Now, tribal councils for both Ute Mountain and Southern Ute, they split their decisions. So there's only 7 members on the council. So you have council members that will take on the health topic, education topic, natural resources topic. They split them up. Southern Ute meets every single day. Ute Mountain Council meets 4 times a month. So I would actually encourage, Ian or somebody from the task force or a group to go down and schedule a time to do a presentation in front of the tribal councils in tribal communities. Actively reach out and schedule that to say, you know what, we're willing to make the travel. We know everybody just assumes that, everything needs to happen in Denver or everything needs to happen on the Front Range. And I think a lot of times the tribes really respect people taking the time to go down and travel to their community, especially if you want to talk about issues in their community. You need to have the boots on the ground. You need to see what that looks like. And then I would also include the environmental program managers for both tribes. Southern Ute has an active, obviously, both tribes are extractive industries. But I will say that both tribes have a conversation around transitioning to a clean energy economy. Ute Mountain has a whole plan on transitioning to that type of economy. Scott Clow is the environmental program manager for the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. And I mean, solar, and the other thing too, is if you go down, I'd encourage you to spend a full day there. And I'd encourage, like at Ute Mountain, to go tour our Ute Mountain Farm and Ranch. There's an article this last Sunday in the Denver Post around the water drought that has impacted our Ute Mountain Farm and Ranch enterprise. We are in a severe is an understatement, drought in southwestern Colorado, and because of climate change. And last year, we have 100% water allocation because of water rights. My great grandfather, who was the last traditional chief of my tribe, he died in 1971. His name is Chief Jack House. My father, he would go to DC and advocate for water rights. My father spent 30 plus years as a tribal elected official advocating for Ute water rights settlement. It was finally done in 1987. And part of the project was building the Dolores Reservoir, or the McPhee Reservoir in Dolores, Colorado. And it solidified that side of the mountains, water rights settlements for the Utes. The other side, which is closer to Durango, Lake Nighthorse is Colorado's newest reservoir. That also solidified Ute water rights settlements between Southern Ute and Ute Mountain Navajo Nation. So because of our severe drought, last year, our 100% water allocation dropped to 10%. We have a 7,000 acre farm and ranch enterprise. 7,000 acres, 10% water allocation means that's 1.5 inches per acre of water. There's no way that that's sustainable. We grow corn. You can go to your nearest Albertsons, you can go to your nearest Whole Foods, and you're likely going to find Ute Mountain Gold. We grow it, we mill it, we package it all on site. We also do a sweet corn, and that's the product that we have. And as we talk about the growth of tribal food sovereignty, that's a part of the plan that Ute Mountain had of, hey, we're going to start educating our young people. We're going to start getting more jobs, skills-based. We're going to bring this tribal food sovereignty conversation to our community. Then this drought hits. This year, we got about 25% water allocation. Still not the best. We're still having difficult conversations. I mean, this is also laying people off. I mean, that's part of that conversation when you can't run that enterprise at that level. And so when you see the articles around Lake Mead and Lake Powell and the fights of the Colorado River, of the upper basin and lower basin, know that the tribes are a part of that conversation and encourage that the tribes be a part of it. I mean, you probably saw in the Colorado Water Plan, I was on the Water Equity Task Force this last year. And that was one thing, was we need to engage tribes. Even the not just saying it, not just putting it in some report that's going to get shelved and collect dust over time or whatever else. We actually want to see what those policies look like. And so I'm glad that you've identified funding opportunities. I will get to, I'm not surprised that with Southern Utes response and around the definition in the third question. But the other thing I wanted to throw out there, and then I'll stop there before transitioning to the second question and take any of your questions, is the engagement of youth councils. The Southern Ute Indian Tribe created the Sunshine Cloudsmith Youth Council several years ago. And I've seen it as one of the most effective ways to engage tribal youth. These are individuals that seek out these terms very similar to tribal council and almost like just grooms them and ready to go and jump into a tribal leadership position. And they have regularly scheduled meetings, and it's a great way to engage with their youth and yet another avenue to be able to get information out. Let's see. So I would say tribal council engagement, staff engagement, go visit them. They have lifted their COVID. There was a lot of COVID mechanisms, or at least protocols that obviously having to do that, but now everything's getting back to normal, and it's great to see. And so those are some of the ones that I would offer right now, and I'll look at the second one. Is there any other question for me now before I transition into that second question? Seeing none,
Ernest, I have one for you, and that is, you being descended from hereditary chiefs, and just where do you feel like we are at on funding, or like what kind of streams of funding or resources are made available for your tribe at this moment in time? Do you see there are holes that some agencies don't have tribal liaisons, those kinds of things, I guess, of where the holes could be filled?
That's a great question. And I think that the biggest issue for my tribe is capacity. We just don't have the staff needed to get a lot of the stuff that we would love to see done. I truly believe, and this is just my personal opinion, that I think a transition from a historically, mineral and gas operation transitioning into a clean energy economy can happen faster, but part of the struggle is that Scott is wearing 20 different hats. And in the Southwest, at least for my tribe, having the partnerships with NGOs, which is happening. You know, the Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Lands, Conservation Colorado. I mean, all these groups they're reaching out, right? But that's the biggest question, is like, how can we help? But at the same time too, I used to say all the time when I was with the state, the worst thing to do when you're a state employee, those of you who work for the state, is go to a tribal community and say you're from the government and you're there to help. You know, it's going to set you back even further than you initially wanted to. And I think part of it too is rural Colorado. We just have to be mindful of the conversations going on in rural Colorado, especially on tribal communities. And I've often said also that I mean, every tribal community and non-tribal community I work with, I tell them that collaboration happens at the speed of trust. That's it. That's the bottom line. And we have so much trust to rebuild between Indigenous communities and any level of government, local government, state government, federal government. And I think this is where task forces, NGOs can come into play and be supportive of helping drive the conversation continuously. And that's where you're going to see the needle start moving, because we're all pushing towards the same goal, right? So if there's funding identified from the state legislature to go, it wasn't until a handful of years ago, believe it or not, where tribes were actually put in the language. Before then, if tribes weren't physically added to the legislative language, then that department had to go the following year and do an amendment and add tribal governments also included for funding, because there was this conversation, and it still is. It still happens around respecting tribal sovereignty, but also seeing a need and wanting to provide funding to an organization on a tribe. Technically, state law does not apply on tribal lands here in Colorado. And folks work really hard, and I'm glad that they do, to ensure that there's that government to government relationship. But now we have so many examples of agreements where you can share funding, where just not too long ago, I know she just had to jump off, that CDPHE didn't have a tribal liaison. The Colorado Department of Human Services didn't have a tribal liaison. You know, Colorado Department of Education wasn't agreeing to look at success rates for students, you know, Indigenous students on Indian reservations. That has all changed just within the last several years. And now it's great to see. And I just think I was hearing earlier, you all were advocating, I don't know what the notes I was looking at, for advocating for tribal liaisons for state agencies. Absolutely. You know, when DNR just got one, just a few months ago, that just gives you an insight as to why these conversations are so important. And even though laws that are passed in Colorado that protect Coloradans around environmental justice do not apply to tribal members on reservations, it doesn't mean that you can't work with a tribal government to maybe pass the same law, pass a similar resolution to support or share data, share information. We were at a very close point, I remember, around sharing data information around active wells on Southern Ute Indian Reservation, because the data was consistently, we don't know what's going on. We know that they're there, but we just don't know what's going on. Wastewater treatment response, the tribe was doing everything that they could, absolutely. But there was also an opportunity to share. The reason why we're sharing and wanting to share information was to be able to be like, hey, we have a program to be able to help support that if that's needed. If you don't, then that's great. But at least if there is an interest, there's an opportunity to engage.
Would you also say that it's, so I think about a tribal liaison, I think more of like, it's a lot for even one person. You think DNR is freaking huge. So just like when we tried to create the environmental ombudsman, we thought we wanted him to have at least 5 support staff. We ultimately didn't get that legislation, but I think it's more than one person. Would you agree with that? I guess is like one of my questions, is like, I don't want a recommendation to be like, oh, just stick one person into this organization and everything is going to change. I feel like that has been a culture of change that has gone on for a long time around equity that hasn't necessarily been as successful because the people aren't resourced the way they need to be.
Absolutely. I think it's better than nothing. But I think once you start using it as a stepping stone, that person can advocate for an advisory board for that position, so that that person doesn't fall victim to being a token or to putting unneeded, unwanted, unwarranted pressure and concern on that one individual to speak on behalf of all Native Americans in the state of Colorado. That's what ends up happening. And to be completely honest, that's the unfortunate thing that gets put on, and Catherine won't say this, but I'll say this because I've been in a position before, and I can say it now, but that's a position that's put on people like her in that position. And so to do that, though, to try to change that way is to be able to bring others like yourself, others and from Indigenous represented communities from the San Luis Valley, from Southwestern Colorado, from Fort Collins, from Colorado Springs, from Pueblo, all over, to be able to be that advisory capacity. So that person isn't just the only person or feeling like they're having to speak on behalf of everybody. I think that's the perception also as Native and Indigenous people, is we're like, wait a minute, that person's not speaking on my behalf. That person's not advocating. And I think this way, if Nicole Miera wants to get engaged with conversations around juvenile justice and delinquency prevention issues and ensuring that Indigenous people are not incarcerated at higher rates than everybody else, and can speak to that, but is not the identified tribal liaison, she can still have a way to engage and use her voice to do that.
Yeah, I like what you're saying there, and it almost feels like the stepping stones already exist. So what is the next stage, right? Because some of these liaisons do exist. We can point to what has worked and what hasn't, and not start from ground zero in the agencies that don't have them. I have a follow-up question. It's a slight different topic, but you were saying state laws don't apply within federal or within tribal boundaries, but there's also allotment. There's a long history of allotment in Southern Colorado. And so can you talk to us a little bit about that balance of CDPHE, say, responsibility for a well operation on an allotted piece of land that is owned by a Coloradan, but deep in the territory of a Ute Nation?
Absolutely. And that example is number one for Southern Ute. This is the other reason why I'd say that, next week I'm moderating a panel for the National Association of Counties annual retreat here in Denver, around government to government working relationships between counties and tribes at a county level. And this is prime example. If you look at La Plata County, which is, the head seat is Durango, and it's also where Southern Ute, majority of Southern Ute land, it is adjacent to. The Southern Ute Indian tribe has had, I couldn't even tell you, it's in the hundreds of intergovernmental agreements, memorandums of understanding, and memorandums of agreement. So IGAs, MOUs, and MOAs. Because of that working relationship, they have a great working relationship with their local county government, and everything from jurisdiction communication to rights of ways with Colorado Department of Transportation. I mean, when you drive from Pagosa Springs to Durango, you'll cross the Southern Indian tribe half a dozen times and you'll never know it. And the only reason why you would know it is because if you were human trafficking, drug trafficking, and you were pulled over on tribal lands, then it depends on kind of a lot of different things. But the jurisdictional maze for checkerboard reservations, it's a nightmare. And there's been numerous articles in Colorado around that. I mean, I remember in 2007, the then U.S. attorney, who's now a good friend, but at the time blew me away, called my reservation, Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, the murder capital of Colorado. At the time, we had a homicide rate of 25 times the state average and 50 times the national average. 1,000 people live in Toyac, and our homicide rate was 25 times the state average and 50 times the national average. So when people throw out huge numbers like that, especially on the front page of the Denver Post, people start thinking, wait a minute here, what's going on? And so the agreements, the importance of having that government to government relationship between a local government at the county level and a tribe like the Southern Indian tribe that has 300,000 acres and 3 non-tribal communities, municipalities, Ignacio, Arbalest, and Marvel are all within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. And so those people that don't know what a checkerboard reservation is, I use the analogy of like a piece of Swiss cheese. The holes in the cheese represent non-tribal members, ranchers, settlers that moved into the area and were able to purchase land within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. And the remaining land was then sold off. Now the tribe is actively trying to, so out of 300,000 acres, 150 is trust land. The other half is fee land. And so the tribe is actively trying to purchase that land back to turn it into trust land. But until they do it, they're very much dependent on these MOUs, MOAs, IGAs to ensure that there's a good working relationship, because their community, the Southern Ute headquarters is, I mean, you can walk to it's 100 yards to the town of Ignacio. So they need to ensure that there's that good working relationship for both the residents there and the tribal members who live within the community. I talk about this all the time with the work that I do now, but we spend, as we should, so much time on the federal trust responsibility. That's very, very important. The state tribal relationship is something that's been elevated and now seen as a best practice to do tribal consultation, which is what Colorado's been doing. The next chapter is local government. Should government to government consultation be required at a local level, at a local city or local county level? That's the question that I'm going to pose to the counties next week, to be completely honest with you.
Well, I mean, please share any of that information with us. I definitely think resourcing DOLA is definitely one that wasn't over our purview, but has continually come up in our dialogues across the subcommittees as needing to take a role in that. All right, I have one more question. I apologize unless anybody else has a question, but my question comes back to, well, you talked about repatriation of artifacts. We also have had people come testify to us about land back. You know, clearly there is public trust land that is held by the state that wasn't always the state of Colorado, as we know. And I know that there are some interesting conversations around, you know, co-governance, like we've seen in Bears Ears, just across the border from where you are. You know, down there in Chimney Rock, we saw tribal engagement for the programming of that sacred space. What's the next step or the next page there for you, Ernest? Because I know, you know, Keystone works on public land, so perhaps you have something there.
No, I mean, Ian, you must be reading my script here. It's like right in tune with everything that it's a great question, because this is the next chapter, right? When I talk about tribal consultation at a local government level, this is the next thing. I mean, I want to remind people that Bears Ears was created with the idea that would be the first example opportunity for a co-management opportunity process for a federal land management system with tribes and local leaders and state leaders and such. Obviously with all the other political stuff that got caught up in it, but that's one of the areas I was most excited about with Bears Ears. Not just that it's traditional, that our Ute Mountain tribe also is part of that coalition of tribes and also utilize that as part of our territory. But co-management and land back, I think there's no roadmap on where to get there, but you can arrive at land back and not do co-management, or you can go to co-management and eventually get to land back. One feeds off the other is my point. And I think that especially with the article that came out in the Atlantic last year around returning tribes, I can't remember who the author was or who it was, but he called for tribes for federal lands, thanks Alexis, for tribes to be to be managing federal lands, that all national parks, federal lands should be returned to tribes. The same conversations happening with Native Hawaiians, right? And the increase of tourism and population growth in Hawaii. And so not just the conversation around the telescope, or not just conversations around DAPL. We're talking about a different way of thinking moving forward about actually having, if we're really serious about having the original stewards being a part of the conversation of stewardship, isn't it kind of weird to not have the original stewards a part of the conversation or be at that table? And I know I'm preaching to the drum group here a little bit, but I think that part of this can be done here in Colorado. Colorado can be that example. The city of Boulder is having active conversations right now on what co-management looks like with parks and open space. Fort Collins is having the conversation as well, because their old CSU Hughes Stadium was a ballot initiative by citizens requesting to return that land back to tribes. You don't even know if tribes even want the land, but the citizens came before and say, hey, we want to return the land. These are awesome conversations that are happening along the Front Range. And as local governments are looking at land management and cultural resource management, that's going to be important. And it leads into my second question, promise Lebanon I was going to get here, that how to engage the local community. So of Colorado's American Indian population, over 80% lives in the Denver metro area alone. That's 7-county district, including Boulder County. One of the biggest impacts I've seen, I've lived in Denver now for about 20 years, or the Denver area. And part of what I've seen is the encroachment or the lack of access for areas that were traditionally used for ceremonial practices, to do sweat ceremonies, to do whatever it might be. The growth of the Front Range, the growth of Colorado, we can point to a lot of different things. But the point is, it's even more important for Jeffco, Boulder, Larimer, you name it, to identify areas to continue to work with Indigenous communities so that they can protect sites that have already been identified or utilized as areas for ceremonial practice, but B, to carve out future areas, because if they don't, that encroachment will continue to take that over. There was a situation that happened in Boulder. Oh gosh, this was over 10 years ago, but there was an individual who had a family member pass, and he needed to do a ceremony in honor of that individual's passing. And it happened to be his daughter. And she actually passed away in the war fighting overseas. And he couldn't get back home fast enough because of what his ceremonial practice needed him to do as a father, as a member of his household. But he didn't know where to do that on the Front Range. And he happened to do that ceremony, which involved eagle feathers, eagle parts, in a very populated trailhead outside of Boulder County. And so unbeknownst to him, individuals that are trafficking that area and just going out for a regular hike, they see these bundles out there and they start to unravel them. They start to look after that. And then it sparked this huge uproar in the community. People that, you can't, well, I don't know, maybe you at this time, I don't know if you can or not, but I haven't tried, but at the time you couldn't Google, ceremonial practices done, you couldn't, there wasn't any roadmap, there wasn't any books. It's information that we all know as Indigenous community members that have been passed down through families, that is very, very sacred and very, very confidential in terms of that individual of doing that. So it threw this whole conversation into a public frenzy, and media outlets were there, they're covering the story. And I use that as an example, as eventually that was going to happen. But I say all this because in 2010, the 2010 census showed that over 70% of the nation's American Indian population lives off of reservations today. Now the 2020 census, I guarantee you, will show over 80%. That's a fast growing number. And that means that our 80% of our American Indian population that lives within the 7 metro county area represents over 200 tribes, is the largest coalition of identified as American Indian Alaska Native, that has various different ceremonies that they need to do and conduct for various times of the year. And so opportunities and places to do and host those type of ceremonies are few and far between. And because of our population growth, we need to be mindful of that. And so Ian, back to your conversation in coordination with the state land board. Yes, I have seen personally land, hundreds of acres of state board land that have been transitioned and given over to the Sand Creek Massacre site. That was a follow-up from then Governor Hickenlooper's apology. Was we can't just make an apology and say, hey, everything's all great, just because you made an apology. The following year, over 600 acres of adjacent state-owned land was identified and just given over to the national park, to the Sand Creek park site. We can continue those conversations. I don't know how, but I think that there's a way and a mechanism for your all's work and connection to lands and climate and everything else around identifying that. And then I want to just end with, and I'll open it up to the last one, the question on broader engagement. And should you identify, what was the third one was, should tribal communities be identified? And I know Southern Ute said they did not want to be a part of that, which is totally understandable. I actually, when talking with Libna earlier, a while back, I said I could probably make the case that tribal communities can be identified as disproportionately impacted communities. We see that now. I mean, CDPHE does a Healthy Kids Colorado report that includes indigenous populations, and people would always go like, wow, these numbers are through the roof. I think that just like the case of Southern Ute, you shouldn't automatically include tribes in that category, but you should open up funding streams and partnership opportunities and engagement with them, only because you want to respect the tribal sovereignty. It doesn't mean that the group can't work on initiatives. That's not it at all. I think that just shows an opportunity to create a program to start working with the tribe. But by not including tribal lands, you also are showing everybody else that's reading the report that they need to respect tribal lands. Very similar, like the conversation with rock climbing. You can't just go on to tribal lands and rock climb. There's always been an ongoing issue and controversy around climbing shiprock or climbing Chimney Rock. Like, tribes want to ensure and get the information out. Look, tribal lands are under tribal jurisdiction. Coordinate that tour with the tribe as a sovereign nation, they'll set it up. But very similar to the programs that we share, if dollars are provided, that's an avenue to be able to build that partnership. And I think that also eventually gets you to maybe creating an agreement around shared data on how you're capturing that data and how the tribe can control it, maintain it, own it, but how you can include it. Just so that, because before I've always seen communities that are adjacent to reservations using the tribe's numbers and the tribe's disproportionate numbers so they could receive the dollars, but the funding never gets to the tribal community. People are always ready to use American Indian numbers because we're through the roof and everything. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, the list goes on and on. But when dollars actually get to tribal communities, who knows if we see that. I think it's been a better process now because we've highlighted it, we've called it out, and state agencies are now actively looking for better narratives around applications for funding if they want to include tribal governments or tribal population numbers. But I think that there's an avenue to be able to include tribes. I'll end with this, and because I know we're here almost to time. maybe many of you saw the recent or the ongoing interaction. I don't know, maybe it's already done by now, between Excel and the Sand Creek massacre site. So there was going to be a some type of pipeline or some type of energy project adjacent in the view shed of the Sand Creek massacre site, which is in Eads, Colorado, 3 hours away from Denver, out east. Go check it out. But the question came up, and I even had conversations with some of the tribal reps around this, but we still don't have a regulation, a law where utilities or energy companies would consult with tribes for proposed projects that are adjacent or could potentially impact cultural sites. And the conversation is also going on in like New Mexico with Chaco Canyon and horizontal drilling, right? But I'd love to see Colorado be one of the first states to put forward a legislative proposal to identify the sites that we already know now, to work with tribes to ensure that there's protection and there's ways to move around it. I think Excel's example is working with the tribe to then have the tribe identify, okay, what would be the respectable view shed distance from the site? What would be, what would be that process? And it's up to them to be able to do that. But, and I know that there's a huge, I can imagine that there'd be a huge fight in the legislature around issues like that. But protection of identified sites already, that I just see how that controversy is going to end up there at some point. If there's a proposed site or not, if it's NAGPRA or not, if it's flagged for whatever it might be. Colorado still has 12 to 15 inadvertently discovered Native American human remains annually. And so that's why that 2007 agreement is so important. That's how we got to over 400 human remains within the state's purview. So I think that when we talk about cultural resource management, we have a long history in Colorado of doing things right. And I think that there are great archaeologists and anthropologists who've sat down with tribal leaders, who've conducted tribal consultations, who can identify, working with tribes, sites that tribes want to be protected, so that anybody knows, at least particularly energy companies, that if there is a proposed project, they're not going to fall into a long-standing feud or legal issue, which wastes time and money on both sides. I'll stop there.
So much, Ernest. I feel like we could do this again. I gathered a lot of recommendations out of there, one of which, is I think a tenet of all kinds of equitable organizing, which is show up in people's space and be willing to listen and to put yourself out there. I have a question for you about your tribe in particular. If we were to make a tour there, and I've had a chance to visit Ignacio because I'm Hickory Apache, and they have done united cultural events together that I've been able to attend. But what could we bring to honor or in trade that is something that would be highly respected by your people? Because I feel like that in my life, the lessons my elders have taught me is you don't go empty-handed, and you try your best to put to do your best. Absolutely.
Well, I'm glad you asked the question. And I usually tell folks that are Indigenous and that recognize that cedar is something that youths historically have always used. It was kind of funny when I got to the Front Range. Now I think sweetgrass, obviously, and tobacco, those elements, youths utilize cedar a lot. So that's something that's highly respected in our communities. If it's a non-Indigenous community or like state agency level, having like the swag, or, a cup or something, a pen, something like that was fine as well. But I think that between those two tribes, they appreciate it, and overall they appreciate that you want to be engaged with. Southern Utah has a fascinating cultural center. and museum that they've spent a lot of time in investing in, and it's remarkable. And they have an opportunity to tell their story. And I think that when you go down there, check it out. And then when you go to Ute Mountain, check out the Ute Mountain Tribal Park. Back in my younger days, used to be a tour guide there, and it's a tribal park managed and operated by the tribe. It's fascinating place, and I can send some contacts for you as well for anybody who'd like to go down there and point you in the right direction.
And I just want to make a note that Rachel mentioned that her and folks from CCIA could help us with those introductions as well, if task force members are interested in kind of making those trips. And I know that CCIA is planning to have that meeting in September, and so that might be a good time to kind of pair those meetings together. So for Ian and Jamie and Ilda, and for even some of the subcommittee members that are not here that would like to make something like that happen. Rachel is our tribal liaison, and she is kind of, I think, the most appropriate avenue to work through to make some of those meetings happen. I know that we're a little bit over time, but I can't help myself with kind of asking this last question, and this might open up a whole nother conversation, and if so, maybe we kind of dedicate a subsequent subcommittee meeting to this topic. But there is this kind of conversation that's been happening about data sovereignty, and we've kind of touched on it multiple times during this hour and a half, but I wonder if we can dedicate some space to specifically talking about that. We did have Gerard on the line, and we do have Kimberly Blackhorse, who is actually Rachel's colleague and a tribal health data analyst on our call right now as well. And so just wanted to mention that we have some experts here. But I think the difficulty with the task force lies in that one of the major feats is that this task force is determining what is a disproportionately impacted community. If we don't include, tribal lands in that kind of geographic mapping, and we can still be, it sounds like maybe a solution is to not include in the mapping, but to still be really considerate about funding resources and other modes of resources. So, there's that, but I wonder if there are any thoughts here from you, Ernest, or, even Kimberly, feel free to share, and any others about that data sovereignty and how this task force should be developing recommendations around that. Colorado EnviroScreen is a tool that is being used to really identify what disproportionately impacted communities are and who they are, and that will also determine where a lot of funding goes to. That's kind of the plan right now. And so how do we kind of juggle these things? How do we be respectful, and how important is the data sovereignty in this space?
I mean, I can do that and then turn it over to Kimberly, who definitely, as expert is looking into this. I remember when we were first establishing conversations around health and wellness at the state, that they were the biggest topics that came up, and actually at the time had the most funding that were able to drive to tribal communities. But a lot of times they required information to be returned back, and which often met challenges with the tribe. The tribe just operates on a different process. That's if they have control. Southern Ute has more control over their, health programs than Ute Mountain, because Ute Mountain has Bureau of Indian Affairs and is run by IHS, as opposed to Southern Ute, which has taken over their own healthcare system. So they have more ability and autonomy separate from Indian Health Service to be able to utilize that. I think that they can be done simultaneously. And when you go down and meet with the tribe, I would present these issues as opportunities for further conversation around having the tribe hold the data, whatever it is that they have the first right of refusal, right? Very similar to FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. That's run by the United Nations and supported by UNDRIP. Like tribes should always have the first right of refusal. But if they're a part of the process and they know what your ultimate goal is and how you're utilizing that, then you could actually potentially create an agreement where you can utilize information that they've allowed you access to do it, and then is returned back to them, and it's not held. I mean, a lot of times we had to always ensure that if there was anything that the state was holding, they needed to know what it was, and they needed to have clear approval and support on how it was being utilized. So it can be done, and it needs to, because I got to tell you, this is my, I don't know, I've had several meetings today, and data sovereignties come up in the majority of them. I'll just say that.
Yeah, so thank you, Lubna, for letting us join this meeting. Part of it too is what I think, and just to add on what Ernest is saying, is changing the language within the act, identifying the tribes with language that identifies them originally. So when you sent me the act, I noticed that when it was identified, Ute Mountain tribes, I believe they were only identified twice as representatives, and were not identified anywhere else. So part of that I would recommend to the task force is to recommend to change the language, to identify them as more than just an Indigenous group, but as their own separate group, because they are a nation of their own. They do have tribal sovereignty. I think that would be part of respecting tribal sovereignty and having a government-to-government relationship. And maybe presenting that, if the task force agrees with that, presenting that with the other Southern Ute Indian tribes and the Mountain Ute tribes, in order to be able to help bridge that relationship. On another note of that too, my colleague Gerard, who had to leave, he also brought up a comment of why not just contacting Southern Ute Indian tribe and asking them how would they like to be identified if it's not identified as the disproportionately underserved community. How would they want to be used in that language? And then using that language in terms of representing it within the act itself.
Those are great points, Kimberly, absolutely. And I think, I mean, again, I wasn't surprised that Southern Ute had the response, because we want to make sure that I mean, in my experience, they've also want to make sure that there's the clear definition that the tribes are in partnership and working with the state, that they're not subject to the state, because then that erodes then that starts to impact the tribal sovereignty and the relationship status of that government to government relationship. So that's, you know, I see that a lot in other dollars. Some people think it's really easy just for funding to be given to tribes, which in a lot of cases, in some cases it does, but the reporting requirements that counties have, you know, a lot of times don't apply to tribes for various reasons. And so I think that it's the reporting and the structure of, wait a minute, if I'm agreeing to this, then does that make me subject to, or does that allow more avenue for state policies to be applied on tribal land, which is definitely not, you know, not going to fly.
So just to add with that, thank you, Ernest, for pointing that out as well. There are, within our neighboring states, have used such agreements in identifying the Native American or Alaskan Native and coming up with a definition of that and separating them from indigenous groups as well. Even though Native American and Alaskan Natives are indigenous groups, they do have federally recognized Indian tribes with, like Ernest has covered, tribal citizenship and tribal membership based upon the tribe itself. So I think it would be good to identify that within the recommendations that this task force will be putting forth.
Yes. Thank you, Ernest, so much for your time. We really appreciate it. We have about 3 more agenda items to get through in the next 20 minutes. So we are going to move on. Would love if you could stick around for the remainder of the meeting, if possible, at least just for this next section. If you need to hop, that's totally fine. Completely understand and respect your time. And thanks, Kimberly, for your insights as well. I do want to move us on to the next agenda item, which is really to just review and elaborate on the current task force draft recommendations that have come out of this subcommittee. And so I will just, you can find those in the agenda, but I'll just copy paste those recommendations into the chat just so folks see them. And so there are a few, but I'll just read them out. One is to provide funding resources to tribal governments. Very, like, I feel like that's pretty vague, but we need to probably elaborate on that further. All state agencies should have tribal liaisons, and I've seen kind of bits and pieces of recommendations of how that could be elaborated on. I think Ilda mentioned in the chat, is it, it's one thing to make sure that the position is created, but what is the decision-making power? The names of power plants named after tribes, such as Cherokee, should be changed. We've had many conversations where, it's just very clear that putting those names on those types of facilities is extremely offensive. Agencies should use innovative strategies to better engage urban indigenous populations. And in our last meeting, some ideas to make that happen were like surveys and polls, respectfully attending and conducting outreach during powwows. And so just wanted to briefly review those. I know, Chase, am I saying your name correctly? I know that you had mentioned that like you had a recommendation or two kind of bubbling up for you, and would welcome you to kind of share that now. And for any others, we've talked about a lot. We've taken notes. I think we're pretty good on pulling out some of the recommendations, but especially to our task force members, as well as members of the public, if there are like really clear-cut recommendations that you want to put in writing and drop in the chat, we'll make sure to record those. But Chase, feel free to come off mute.
Yeah, so actually, I think Ernest talked a little bit about it. You guys had kind of started mentioning about the idea of co-management. And actually in Canada and in Australia, there are these programs that have been pretty successful called Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs. So in 2019, the United Nations did a global assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And apparently they discovered that lands that are being stewarded by Indigenous people are healthier, more vibrant, are better able to stand up to climate change, essentially. And there was a similar study done by British Columbia, I guess, that found very similar results. And I can link those if people want them. But suffices to say that if the council cares about environmental justice and about Indigenous people and about fighting climate change, as we said, like it would be really amazing if more of the land could be stewarded by the people. So there have been several examples of IPCAs in Canada and Australia. Let's see. Sorry, I have like a little mini PowerPoint that I'm looking at myself. But essentially IPCAs are, I think, really incredible because they can be expanded upon, like kind of like how Bears Ears is. But I just think it's interesting, and I would love the council to look more into IPCAs. I have a list of references and resources that I gathered while I was doing some research. But the reason that these work is because it honors the relationship between the people and the land. It's not just a designated area that's protected and then is left unattended. It's active stewardship being done by interested Indigenous people. Yeah, and it's proven. So I don't know. I guess I just don't think that we have to reinvent the wheel. We have these programs that are successful, that are happening. They're Indigenous led. They represent a long-term commitment to conservation, and they elevate Indigenous rights and responsibilities as well. And it's not just like co-management. It could be Indigenous governments are either fully in control. It could be shared decision making, which I think is a lot what co-management did in Bears Ears. Or yeah, let's see. Sorry, somebody's talking to me. Yeah, to begin with, for sure. Let me see my little list here. There are these people called land guardians, and they have like many different programs in Canada. But I have a whole bunch of different links if people want to look at them. I just think that it would be a really good step if that to put forward in the recommendations, just thinking bigger for Indigenous people and the future of Colorado and the world. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Chase, for that suggestion. And I think we can definitely craft a recommendation around that if Yilda and Ian and Jaime, if you're kind of in agreement with kind of developing a recommendation around that. And just to be clear, the idea would be to have Indigenous protected and conserved areas in Colorado. Ilda, Ian, Jamie, are you all kind of, would you support a recommendation like that? Cool, thanks. And sorry, all I have to be, just very careful because we want to just ensure that these recommendations are coming from you all, from members of the public in the task force. And so that's why I just asked for that endorsement.
Chase, thank you so much for this information. I think I definitely would like to, read further into it. I think as we're drafting what the specific recommendation will be like. So it's something that is tangible. And I think something that we, as part of the final recommendations, we need about 2/3 of the task force to approve in order to move forward. So I think that's something that I want to make sure that we're drafting carefully and ensuring that it's something that we can get through the whole task force. But if you have any resources, or I know I see what Jaime, you kind of posted in here, or wait, was it you, Jaime? No, sorry, Chase. I see this one and I see Jaime's document. So yeah, if you have any other resources to share, we'd love to share them along also with our task force.
Yeah, so in this list, Land Needs Guardian, there's Illy Nationhood, there's a whole resources dedicated to the IPCA. They have like a knowledge basket, I guess, which I assume is just like the basic information needed. There's a paper specifically about Indigenous protected areas and the benefit of these. Like, it's not just going to be in Colorado, I really recommend, not just reaching out to like tribal leaders like the Ute, Mountain Ute, and Southern Ute, but as Ernest said, any of the other historically connected tribes, the hundreds, as well as any urban Indians, organizations, activists, groups, clubs, anything, even if it's not on the surface, like conceivably like environmentally related. When it comes to Indigenous people, oftentimes the land is the thing that connects us all. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Chase, for that. Just for the interest of time, I'm going to move us on to our Zoom poll. Yeah, Catherine, go ahead.
Sorry, really quick comment before you move on. I just wanted to encourage the task force to really look at when the first recommendation, when it says providing funding resources to tribal governments. I thought my camera was on, sorry. There is a bill that was passed this last session, Senate Bill 22-104, that specifically charges the legislation and CCIA to hold consultations with Southern Ute and Ute Mountain in terms of those funding opportunities that are provided to local governments and ensure that they include tribal governments. So I think delving into a little bit more specifics of, is it going beyond, right, the two tribal nations? Is it including other tribal nations? What does that mean in terms of like the state offering funding opportunities to other tribal nations that don't have jurisdiction within the state? And then what does it look like for funding opportunities to be provided specifically towards AIAN serving organizations as well that help do this work? You know, I think that's been part of it, is that the majority of the AIAN communities do live along the Front Range. So I would just encourage the task force to do just a little bit deeper dive in what does that specifically look like in terms of those funding opportunities and creating those pathways to ensure that those tribal nations and organizations can receive the funds. I think Ernest did allude to that capacity of tribes and organizations. So what does that look like, instead of just saying like, here's all the money, do what you will with it? Like, what does that look like for the steps to increase capacity within tribes in order for them to effectively use the funds that they are receiving? And then the second one is around the surveys and polls, especially with just assessment around housing needs, is that there is a report that actually DIFRAC within their Native American housing circle just did within the Denver metro area around housing needs specifically. So I think that what I wonder or ponder is, you know, what is that communication between all of the community work, the AIA organizations work? How is that ensured that it's effectively shared across community members, so we're not missing certain entities? So we're not, I think someone said, like, not recreating the wheel, right? So if these assessments are already out there and these needs are already out there being published, ensure that they're being effectively shared. So not another housing assessment, because I don't think we want to get back into that routine of continually doing surveys and continually doing assessments when we know the need is there and know that the data is there, ensuring that our community members are experiencing the highest disproportionalities. The data is out there. What are we doing about it to address it? And I think that is the extra step. So that's all that I would encourage. Thank you again just for the invitation and for allowing me to speak. So thanks.
Awesome, thank you. And I see Ian's comment, constantly connecting funding in resources to this work. So I think that's, and Morgan, if you could just make note of that as well, just to make sure that there is funding kind of connected to all these recommendations, but specifically to this one. Okay, one thing I just want to mention is that I know that we've kind of glossed over some of the recommendations that were listed here. I will just note that we have a couple minutes at the end dedicated to talking about kind of next steps and the direction that we want to take this subcommittee. That said, we will definitely spend some time at the next subcommittee meeting doing a deeper dive into the recommendations. I think between now and the next subcommittee meeting, the recommendations are going to change a lot. And there's going to be a lot more based on, you know, there's so many amazing nuggets of information and, you know, more detailed recommendations that we'll be able to kind of flesh out and then send out prior to the next subcommittee meeting that we can discuss in a lot more detail. I do want to take a moment to launch this poll. This was actually crafted by by Kimberly Blackhorse and by Gerard, who was previously in the call, but there are tribal health data analysts at CDPHE, and I just wanted to go ahead and launch this poll, and it's 3 questions. if folks could go ahead and answer. And the idea is that, we may be able to formulate recommendations around some of these questions, but really pointed questions I think would be helpful for us to learn the answers to. So I will pause for a couple minutes and give people the opportunity to answer. And especially if our task force members could respond, that would be very helpful. Thanks, Hilda, for the thumbs up. Okay, and then Jamie and Ian, if you could just give me a thumbs up and let me know that you've had the opportunity to respond once you're done. Cool. Thumbs up from Ilda, thumbs up from Ian. Great. Thanks, Jamie. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and let's see the results. So for question 1, Native American Indians, Alaskan Natives should be generalized as Indigenous peoples. We have responses kind of across the board, with people responding to everything except for strongly agree, with the majority of people saying neither agree nor disagree. For question 2, tribal governments, the Ute Mountain Ute and Southern Ute Indian tribes in Colorado should have the same sovereign rights as the state of Colorado or Canada, and unanimous strongly agree. And question 3, there are specific guidelines for collecting data on urban Native American Indians, Alaskan Natives, and should be followed. That should be followed. And kind of responses ranging from strongly agree, agree to neither agree nor disagree. Okay, Kimberly, I wasn't sure if you wanted to elaborate on this any further.
Yeah, Lubna, if I could, just for number 1, so there are resources available for the task force to look at, which I can put into the chat. But just to give some context, and it's mainly revolving around what Ernest was discussing, and I believe what the assignment was here. So just again, just to rebrush of what Ernest was saying. So within the United States, there are about 575 federally recognized tribes. And each tribe is protected and has their own sovereignty, tribal sovereignty, which gives them the right to self-govern. And each of their own requirements for tribal citizenship or membership. So tribal enrollment for Native Americans and Alaskan Native tribes citizens are part of the U.S. federally recognized tribes. So just as another recommendation for this task force to make is that when the act, again, I was reading, it did not clearly define Indigenous groups from Native American and Alaskan Native groups, which there is clear distinction. So as in, if we could say that all Native American and Alaskan Native people are Indigenous people, but not all Indigenous people are Native American or Alaskan Natives. We have relations in South America, and we have relations in Canada and North America. But then we're talking about specifically separating the Native American and Alaskan Natives who have tribal sovereignty rights and have rights just as much as, I guess, in our next question that we will see is governing rights just as much as Colorado and just as much as Canada. And to share those recommendations and just to give you all some extra resources, I will copy that right into the chat for number 1.
And Kimberly, just to be clear, and so we're capturing this correctly in our notes. So the recommendation on your end is that there should be a distinction between Native American Indians and Alaskan Natives.
No, there should be a distinction between Indigenous people and a Native American and Alaskan Natives should be separate.
Okay.
From instead of just lumping them into generalized Indigenous peoples.
Got it.
Okay, that's what I meant. I hope that that part is clear. And there is also a state to help the committee. I think I can put this in, but there is a to the committee for with this. There is a New Mexico state bill. I believe it was done in 2009, state bill number 196 that uses specific language to help with the separation. If you all want to look for the terms and for the definitions. And then again, for question number 2, I do have references for this. So sovereignty, again, is the authority to self-govern. The United States Constitution recognizes tribal nations as sovereign governments. Tribal nations as sovereign governments are just like Canada or Colorado, to be precise. So again, just looking at the language within the act and then recommending the task force to separate those languages is our suggestion that would make the connection between tribal government and the state government on you're making tribal government recognizable and giving them the recognition of being their own separate government. And lastly, but not least, third question, are there specific guidelines to collecting data on urban Native American Indians and Alaskan Natives? Yes, there is. So there, again, to give context, there are 12 tribal epidemiology centers within the United States, and one of them, which is called the Urban Indian Health Institute, they created guidelines, best practices in order to collect information. So this, like Catherine has said, there's information already out there. There is polls and there are information and data sources that have already been collected and are online that you may have access to because they've already created reports with this information. So please go right ahead and use these resources. And yes, so thank you for taking the poll. Thank you for allowing this time to help you all with the recommendations.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for that. And I wish we had kind of more time to deep dive into some of those, and apologies for the time limitation on the meeting. That said, I mean, we talked about a lot today, and I know Ian had to drop off, but Ilda and Jaime, before we go, I would be curious to hear from you if there's any like really pressing areas that you think we should be focusing on for our next subcommittee meeting.
I think we haven't discussed as a group all of the recommendations that we have gathered up to now. We were not able to do it during the at-large meeting that we had in person. So I think it will be important for us to discuss the new ones that have been added throughout this meeting and the previous ones. And I think just having more participation of the subcommittee, I think we're about half of them today. So wanted to make sure that we can have further representation of the subcommittee. So I don't know if it is making like a strong call for our next meeting. But I would definitely recommend being able to have a follow-up. And I think sharing all these resources, Lubna, to them, because I think there's such great content, like the one that Chase has provided, what Kimberly has shared with us, and even just the recording of today's presentation will be fantastic.
Okay, thank you, Ilda. Anything?
Also, oh, sorry. And also, I think if we want to get moving on the scheduling of those meetings, I know, or sort of side visits or whatever, however we want to call them, I think will be really great for us to get started moving the needle in that space. I know it takes time to schedule everybody in the subcommittee or in the task force, but we should start building those relationships in person.
Sorry, Ilda, to your last point, were you suggesting that we go ahead and schedule the subcommittee meeting, or were you suggesting that we not only schedule the next subcommittee meeting, but try to do it in person?
No, I was referring to the in-person engagement that had been brought up by our speakers. I know there were a couple of different
Oh, right. Okay.
places that were elevated that we should, or invitations that we should be able to be in person.
Yep. Okay. Great. Yeah, we definitely have some homework items. And then Jamie, want to give you a chance to chime in as well.
Yeah, I agree with everything Hilda said, and I just wanted to emphasize, I guess, that I think it would be important to really strongly encourage the other members of the task force to take a look at the recording. There's so much excellent information that's been shared here this afternoon, this evening, and also I know y'all are great at getting notes and the chat captured and everything. We just wanted to make sure we get all this awesome information. And yeah, I like I say, other than that, I agree with everything Elda said and look forward to diving deeper into some of this information and talking about potential recommendations.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. I think the only other thing I might try to do is we've been in touch with Scott Clow, who is the I'm going to forget his title now, but is like the environmental relations person with Ute Mountain Ute, and so we may try to continue to get him to come speak with our group. I think that's just the subject matter expertise is like it never fails us in terms of like progressing the recommendations. So that and I'm seeing thumbs up from both of you, so hopefully we can continue to act on that. So we'll try to get Scott for the next meeting, and regardless, we will do a deeper dive into the recommendations. I think this is a super productive meeting, and I think we have a lot to work with. So yeah, and then for like attendance purposes, I did send the announcement out to the full task force in hopes that like more people would come, like more people outside of the subcommittee would come, and I honestly just contribute our low attendance to vacationing. I think I got all the automatic vacation notices like immediately when I hit send. So I think it's just the timing, it being July. So hopefully we'll have a better turnout in August. So, all right, well, yeah, thank you both so much for your participation and attendance, and thanks to Ian, who's no longer here, but yeah, much appreciated.
Thank you, folks. Have a good one.